Everyone in Anchorage warned this old veteran never to step back into those mountains. And now he finally understands why. After losing everything, a 72-year-old soldier tried to rebuild his life in a remote cabin with only his loyal German shepherd by his side. But when the dog began growling toward the frozen tree line, everything changed. They're surrounded by howling winter wind. A pack of wolves stood guard over a mysterious young woman, one who looked exactly like the daughter he lost 40 years ago. What this veteran and his dog uncovered would rip open old wounds, expose long-buried secrets, and give him one final chance at family, if he's brave enough to take it. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. We love knowing how far these stories travel. Snowfall pressed against the silent pines of Anchorage's frozen wilderness, the world hushed in white and wind. Frank Miller moved stiffly through the cabin's main room joints, arguing with every cold morning. At 72, he carried the rugged weight of a man who had known too many winters, too many wars, and far too many regrets. His shoulders were still broad, beneath a heavy buffalo plaid flannel jacket, a red and black pattern faded by time yet stubborn against age. His beard remained thick, more frost than iron, now framing a face carved by grief and survival. Deep-set hazel eyes studied every shadow as if the world might betray him again at any second. He had once been Staff Sergeant Miller of the U.S. Army, sharp, confident, unbreakable. But war changes men, and heartbreak finishes the job. His wife Mary, gentle and freckle-cheeked with laughter, like summer rain, had died too young. Their daughter Laura, fierce and bright-eyed, had grown tired of living in fear of his bitterness. One night, words thrown like weapons, he drove her away. She never returned. The silence she left behind was a punishment he woke to daily. Now it was only him and Ranger. Ranger was a German shepherd, 4 years old, muscular frame coat, black and tan like burnt caramel over midnight stone, and amber eyes that seemed to understand more than any dog should. He was disciplined, alert, tailor-made for loyalty. But he was also gentle, something Frank barely remembered how to be. Ranger had been Frank's therapy dog after the nightmares refused to leave. Now he was his reason to get out of bed. Outside, a soft howl slipped through the pine walls. Frank opened the cabin's door. The wind slapped cold against his face, sharp and punishing. The wolves were waiting again. There were 7 of them, all gray with winter-thick fur, a pack bound not by ownership, but by survival. Frank had first stumbled upon them decades ago, abandoned pups near death. He fed them goat's milk from trembling hands. They grew, and though wild instincts pulled at them like tides, they never truly left him. Wolves had a strange sense of loyalty. They chose their family. The alpha wolf, Frost, approached. She was massive, silver fur, rippling like moonlight on snow eyes, sharp and wary. Frank knelt slightly, stretching his hand. Frost pressed her muzzle to his palm, an acknowledgement, not submission. A ritual of trust. Ranger, standing tall beside Frank, offered a soft growl of warning, both protective and proud. Frost ignored him with the entitlement of a queen. Frank glanced east. The clouds were too dark for morning. A storm was coiling in the distance. "Stay close today," he murmured, though whether to the wolves or to the ghosts, he didn't know. The day dragged like wet boots. Frank chopped wood, stacked the pieces with military precision, straight lines, no wasted space. Work was a refuge, a noise to drown thoughts. But memories crept through cracks like wind under a door. Laura at 8 years old, laughing as she tried to braid his beard. Laura at 17, screaming that he didn't understand her. Laura crying, he remembered that worst, because fathers aren't supposed to make their daughters cry. He had shouted the words that ruined him, "If you leave, don't come back." She didn't. The pain had become a scar he touched daily, afraid to heal. Ranger's bark shattered the memory. A sharp, frantic sound. Frank spun toward the tree line. Ranger was already sprinting, muscles slicing through snow, ears pinned, tail stiff like a spear. The wolves surged after him, not hunting, protecting. What the hell? Frank grabbed his coat and rifle boots, barely laced, as he trudged into the forest's teeth. The woods tightened around him as snow began to fall again, thicker, faster. The sky dimmed to the color of old bruises. Ranger's urgent barks echoed through the pines like a flare in darkness. Frank's breath turned raw in his throat. Then silence. He stopped. The forest listened. At the base of a collapsed spruce, Ranger and the wolves formed a protective circle, all hackles raised and bodies tense as drawn wire. Frank forced through the last stretch of snow and froze. There, half buried in frost and pine needles, was a young woman. She was maybe 25. Her body slender under shredded hiking gear, green parka torn at the sleeves, dark jeans stiff with ice boots cracked and soaked. Her face pale as snowfall was framed by tangled dark hair sticking to her cheeks. Yet despite the cold draining life from her skin, she was unmistakably beautiful. A delicate jawline strong enough to seem familiar, soft eyes hidden beneath lashes, iced shut lips cracked with desperate breaths. Frank knelt shaking as he brushed snow from her face, and then his heart stopped. It was Laura's face. Not exactly youth was sharper here, unscarred by life, but the resemblance was so fierce it clawed his chest open. The same high cheekbones, the same gentle curve at the chin, the same shape of eyebrows that once furrowed at him in anger. His voice splintered. "Laura!" But the woman did not respond. She was barely breathing. Ranger nudged Frank's arm, whining low and urgent. Frost nosed the girl's shoulder, then looked at Frank with an expression close to command. They waited for him to act. The veteran's hands trembled. War had taught him how to carry dying bodies, but never how to save a stranger who looked like a daughter. He slipped his arms beneath the young woman. She weighed almost nothing, bones, frostbite, and willpower. Her head fell against his chest like a memory trying to return home. He stood, boots sinking deep. Ranger and the pack flanked him, silent guardians cutting through snow. Should he leave her here? She was a stranger. She might bring trouble. He had spent a lifetime escaping trouble. But he saw Laura again, wet-eyed, begging him to understand. He couldn't fail twice. "Hang in there," he whispered into her frozen hair. "I didn't save my daughter when I had the chance. I'll save you." As they neared the cabin, the wolves howled long, low, mournful, as if announcing the arrival of fate. Frank kicked the door open with his shoulder, carrying the woman to his bed, Ranger right behind him. He stripped off her wet boots, covered her in every wool blanket he owned. Her skin was ice, her pulse a fading echo. He stared at her face, fear twisting his gut. Not fear of the storm, fear of hope. Because if this girl lived, he might have to live too. Outside, frost howled once more, sharp warning, protective. The storm swallowed the world. And the past he buried under 40 winters began to rise. The storm had died sometime before dawn, leaving behind a world so quiet, it felt as though the snow itself was holding its breath. Inside the cabin, the crackling fire worked tirelessly to push away the cold that had nearly claimed the young woman, now lying beneath a pile of wool blankets. Frank Miller sat slouched in a wooden chair beside the bed, eyes gritty and red-rimmed, sleep only a rumor he hadn't believed in for years. Ranger lay curled at his boots, head resting over Frank's foot, as if anchoring him to the moment, reminding him that what was happening was real and not some cruel memory resurrected from the past. The woman's breathing had steadied, though still shallow. Her cheeks had regained just enough color to suggest life instead of death. Frank studied her features again, the dark hair, the slope of her nose, the shape of her eyelids. He had spent 40 years trying to forget the face of his daughter, only to have it returned to him on a stranger. Part of him wanted to look away, to protect the fragile walls he'd spent decades reinforcing. But curiosity and fear kept dragging his gaze back to her. Suddenly she shifted, a faint sound escaping her lips. Ranger's head snapped up. Frank leaned forward, breath caught in his throat. The woman's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, drifting like someone trying to remember where they had left themselves. Then they locked onto Frank. "Where?" Her voice rasped like cracking ice. "You're safe," Frank managed, though the word felt foreign. "You collapsed out in the woods. My dog found you." Her gaze darted around confusion, sharp in her amber-brown eyes. She spotted Ranger and stiffened. "It's all right," Frank said quickly. "He won't hurt you." Ranger wagged his tail, once slow and reassuring. The woman swallowed, wincing at the pain in her throat. Who are you?" "Frank Miller," he answered. "I live here, alone." He hesitated. "What's your name?" She seemed to consider the question longer than necessary, as though the simplest truths were slippery. "Emily," she finally said. "Emily Carter." Her voice shook not just from cold. Fear was threaded through every word, tight and strained. "You were out there alone?" Frank asked. "In this storm." "I was on a research expedition," she replied, trying to sit up. Frank instinctively reached out to help, then froze, unsure if touching her was allowed, or safe, or wise. She steadied herself against the wall instead. "I'm a wildlife researcher. University of Montana. I was tracking reports of a wolf pack in Anchorage territory that shouldn't exist." Her eyes flicked toward the window, where beyond frost and glass, dark shapes moved through the snow wolves in silent vigilance. Emily inhaled sharply. "They saved me, didn't they?" Frank nodded once. "They're unusual." Ranger barked a single warning. Frank turned just in time to see movement on the floor. Emily's soaked backpack had shifted, spilling its contents slightly. A corner of a silver object peeked out. Frank kneeled, pulling the pack closer. "Mind if I check your things? I need to know if you're injured, if there's any medication, anything important." Emily hesitated but nodded. "Go ahead, nothing to hide." Frank opened the damp bag and carefully laid the items on the table. A half-frozen protein bar, a crinkled water pouch, a weather notebook filled with smudged maps and wolf sketches, a folded parka liner. Then he found it. A silver compass. Small but elegant. The metal was worn smooth edges rounded by years of handling. On the back, engraved initials, LM. Frank's heart punched upward, choking him. His hands went numb. "No, no, no, no!" He lifted the compass and turned it in the dim firelight, unable to breathe. "That belonged to my mother," Emily said quietly from the bed. "She always kept it with her. Said it was a piece of home." Frank's pulse hammered in his ears so loudly he almost didn't hear her. "What was her name?" he asked, voice cracking along fault lines he'd tried to bury. Emily's eyes softened, sadness pooling deep. "Laura. Laura Miller." Frank's knees almost gave out. His fingers tightened around the compass like it could vanish if he loosened his grip. She had tried to speak, but his voice fractured. "She's your mother." Emily nodded slowly. "She died 6 months ago." The world tilted. Ranger nudged Frank's leg urgently, grounding him in reality before his grief dragged him under. "Before she died," Emily continued, her voice trembling, "she told me to come here, to find you." Frank forced himself to look at her fully. She was watching him with cautious hope, like a child afraid the truth might scare away everything they came to find. "You're my granddaughter." Emily flinched, tears stinging her eyes. "Yes." Frank sank heavily into the chair, staring at the compass, as though it held all the answers he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. The grief he'd carried alone, pride and fear, hardened into armor, suddenly cracked in his chest. "I tried to find this place," Emily whispered, hugging the blankets around her. "My mom, she told me stories. Not happy ones, but full of love anyway. She said Anchorage was home. She said there were wolves here who never abandoned her. She wanted me to see them, to see where she came from." Frank's throat clenched. Guilt flooded him, sour and suffocating. Every cruel word he'd thrown at Laura came back with claws. "Why didn't she come back herself?" Frank whispered through clenched teeth. "She tried," Emily replied. "More than once. But she said she knew you didn't want her here, that you'd made that clear." Frank dropped the compass as if it burned him. The metal clattered loudly on the table. Ranger whined. Frank stared into the fire, seeing nothing but Laura's tearful face as she left his own voice echoing after her like a curse. "If you leave, don't come back." Emily reached slowly into her pack again and revealed something else, a photograph sealed in a small plastic bag. She handed it to Frank. He hesitated before taking it. The image hit him like artillery. Laura young, radiant, standing in summer sunlight, holding a baby with eyes like golden honey. Behind them, unmistakable and haunting. His cabin, his life, everything he'd thrown away. Frank pressed the photo to his chest body, shaking as decades of regret ripped open wounds that had never been allowed to heal. Emily's voice was softer now, smaller. "She loved you, even when she didn't understand you, even when she couldn't be here." Frank wiped at his face angrily. "Why didn't she tell me about you?" "She couldn't," Emily whispered. "She was afraid of being rejected again. And she didn't want me to grow up feeling unwanted." The silence that followed was absolute. Not even the wolves howled. Finally, Emily shifted again, grimacing with pain. Frank snapped back to the present. "You need rest," he said hoarsely. "You've been through hell." "So have you," Emily answered. He looked at her. He really looked this time not as a ghost of his daughter, but as someone standing at the threshold of a second chance. Ranger placed his head gently on the edge of the bed beside Emily. She tentatively stroked his fur. His tail thumped softly. Approval. Frank turned away before she could see the way that simple gesture broke him again. He picked up the compass, closing his fist around it, finding strength in the cold metal. "We'll talk more when you're stronger," he said. "For now, you're safe here." Emily exhaled shakily and finally let herself drift back into sleep. Ranger remained as guardian at her bedside. Frank stood by the window, staring into the snow-drenched forest, where wolves moved like shadows, protectors of a story he thought was over. His granddaughter was here. His daughter's love had survived death. But forgiveness. Forgiveness would be the hardest battle of all. Outside, Frost lifted her muzzle and howled a long, rising call that sounded less like warning and more like welcome. Frank's hand tightened around the compass. For the first time in 40 years, the door to his heart wasn't locked. The wind outside had grown restless again, rattling the window panes like impatient fingers tapping glass. Evening light, faint and silver, bled into the cabin, casting long shadows that trembled with the flicker of the fire. Frank Miller stood at the small wooden counter, gripping the silver compass so tightly his knuckles whitened beneath weathered skin. The weight of the truth pressed against his ribs like an avalanche waiting to fall. On the bed, Emily Carter lay sleeping once more, though her rest was troubled, brow creased, breathing uneven, as if her dreams chased storms. Her dark hair fanned against the pillow, still slightly damp from melted snow, and Ranger remained curled at the foot of the bed, vigilant as ever, ears twitching toward every creak of the old cabin. Frank had tried to stay strong. He had remained stone in desert steel, in enemy fire, an unbroken wall against the worst the world could hurl. But this girl sleeping in his home with his daughter's face carrying his daughter's belongings, this was a battle he had never learned how to fight. He forced himself to sit on the chair by the bed, breathing through the tightness in his chest. He watched Emily's face, and in his mind saw another Laura's superimposed over her features, younger and full of fire. Emily stirred and slowly opened her eyes. They found Frank immediately, as if pulled there. She blinked, gathering herself, then studied him with an emotion he did not yet dare name. "You stayed," she murmured, voice still fragile from cold and grief. Frank cleared his throat, unused to conversation, that wasn't barked orders or awkward grocery store exchanges. "You needed watching," he said. "That fever of yours didn't leave easy." Emily attempted a small smile, but it faltered. She pushed herself upright with difficulty and glanced toward her backpack. "I have something for you," she whispered. Frank's stomach coiled with dread and anticipation as she retrieved a small waterproof envelope. It was crinkled and creased, the edges soft from being carried close to the heart. Emily held it with two hands almost reverently before offering it to him. "She wrote this," Emily said. "In the hospital. She wanted you to have it." Frank took the envelope with fingers that trembled miserably. His name was on the front. "Dad?" His chest clenched. His name, his title, had not been spoken with affection in over 40 years. The seal tore easily, as if the letter had been waiting to be opened. On the paper, Laura's handwriting was unmistakable, messy loops and rushed strokes, the way she wrote when emotion overwhelmed her patience. "Dad, I never stopped loving you. I was stubborn, yes, but I was always your daughter. I always hoped we could find our way back. If you ever read this, it means I couldn't get to you. Not in time. Please don't let that be the end of our story. Emily is good. She is brave. She needs family. You need her too. Take care of each other for me. Forgive me. And forgive yourself." Frank's heart fractured cleanly down the middle. He felt tears before he knew he was crying, hot, unstoppable, a flood finally breaking the dam pride had built. Emily looked down, giving him the dignity of grieving without a witness, but her own tears slipped quietly down her cheeks. "She wanted you to know she never blamed you," she whispered. Frank managed a broken breath, but she should have. "No," Emily answered firmly, the first spark of her mother's fierceness showing in her tone. "She understood. You were hurting. She forgave you long before you forgave yourself." The words, gentle yet devastating, left him reeling. Ranger pressed his head into Frank's knee as if trying to hold him together. Frank wiped his face with a shuddering inhale. "There's something you should see too." He stood on unsteady legs and crossed the room to a corner where the cabin floor had a single, uneven plank. He knelt and with practiced motions pried it up. Dust and memories puffed into the air. Beneath the floorboards lay a small wooden chest, edges, worn latch, tarnished by time. Frank lifted it with both hands, setting it on the table. The chest was simple, but the hinge creaked like a door to the past. Inside, stacked neatly tied in bundles with old twine, were dozens upon dozens of letters. Some envelopes yellowed, others still crisp with untouched stamps. Each bore the same return address, Laura Miller, and the same never-opened fate. Emily inhaled sharply. "You kept them." "I couldn't read them," Frank rasped, ashamed. "Not when I was too afraid of what they'd say. It was easier to pretend she'd forgotten me than to face the truth that I drove her away." Emily reached toward the box, but didn't touch the letters, respecting the sacredness. "It's not too late to hear her now." Frank's hands hovered over the envelopes, palms sweating. The fire popped behind him like a subtle nudge. He picked up the first letter, 1978, the year she left. He opened it. "Dad, I made it to the city. It's loud and crowded, but they don't stare at me like I'm a creature here. I hope you're okay. I hope the wolves are okay. I miss you. I wish you'd come after me." Frank clutched the paper to his chest, breath stuttering. He opened another. "Dad, I'm starting school next month. I'm scared. I wish I knew you were proud of me." Another. "Dad, I met someone. His name is David Klein, dark hair, green eyes, kind smile. You would like him. He listens." "Dad, I'm pregnant. I named her Emily. I hope one day she'll know her grandfather." "Dad, please answer, please." The letters blurred with grief as Frank kept reading years of milestones he had missed. Happiness he hadn't shared. Pain he hadn't eased. His vision swam until he could no longer see through the tears. A soft cry came not from Frank, but from Emily. She covered her mouth, shoulders trembling, grieving the mother she had lost, and the love her mother had never stopped giving. Ranger leaned into Frank once more, offering silent strength. And outside, as if sensing the storm in the cabin, the wolves howled low and mournful voices echoing loss back to the sky. Frank closed the letter gently and looked at Emily with eyes red and raw. "I can't undo what I did," he said. "But maybe I can do better now." Emily nodded, wiping tears. That's all she ever wanted. Something shifted in the room then. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the possibility of it. Frank stood straighter, squaring the weight of his past on his shoulders. For the first time in decades, the veteran was not hiding from his ghosts, he was confronting them. He placed the letters reverently back into the chest. His voice was quiet but steady. "Tomorrow, when you're stronger, we'll read them together." Emily's eyes glimmered, a fragile mix of sorrow and hope. "I would like that," she whispered. Outside, snowflakes drifted softly through the dark, like tiny remnants of starlight. The wolves' howls faded into silence, and inside the cabin a new kind of warmth began to settle, uncertain, trembling, but real. For the first time since Laura left, Frank Miller wasn't alone with his regret. The letters had spoken, and the future, however fragile, was opening its first door. Nightfall arrived too early in Anchorage winters, as if the sun itself feared wandering too long among these haunted pines. By late afternoon, a rising wind began to tear through the valley, twisting snow into violent spirals. The wolves sensed it first. Frost, the silver alpha, paced anxiously at the tree line, ears pinned flat, her breath a misty warning. Ranger stood rigid beside her tail, low nose lifting to taste the change in the air. A storm wasn't coming. It was already here. Frank Miller stepped outside, bracing heavy boots on the cracking ice. His red and black buffalo plaid flannel snapped like a battle flag in the wind. He had spent years reading weather as intimately as the lines on his own palm. This wasn't a normal snow squall. The clouds over the Chugach Mountains had gone a strange, bruised purple thick enough to choke out moonlight. Static crackled in the air. Inside the cabin, Emily Carter was gathering up their newly opened memories, folding Laura's letters back into the chest like sacred relics. Her skin still carried a faint, sickly pallor from hypothermia, but her eyes were clearer now, sharpened by fear and urgency. She had changed into a simple gray sweater Frank kept for emergencies. It hung loose on her slim frame. Her dark hair fell in damp waves past her shoulders, face flushed from the heat of the fire and still receding fever. "What's wrong?" she called out, as Frank stepped back inside, stamping off snow. "The storm's turned nasty," Frank muttered. "This one could bury us in our sleep." Before Emily could respond, a sudden sharp howl split the night, high-pitched, panicked. Frost bolted into the woods. Ranger barked, frantic pawing at the door to be let loose. Emily rushed to his side. "Something's wrong," she said, voice tight. Frank nodded grimly. The pups. 3 of Frost's youngest, recently weaned but still foolish, had been playing near a ravine earlier. If they'd strayed too far, the storm could swallow them whole. Frank snatched his rifle and slung it over his shoulder, checking the chamber out of habit. He didn't want to fire it unless he had to, but the wilderness didn't tend to negotiate. Emily grabbed a flashlight, hands trembling. "I'm coming with you." "Absolutely not," Frank snapped. "You're still recovering." She lifted her chin, a stubborn flicker of Laura's fire. "They saved my life. I'm not letting them die out there." Frank stared at her, the resemblance so sharp it could cut, and found he had no strength left to argue. "Stay close to me. Don't let go of Ranger." Ranger shoved the door open as soon as Frank unlocked it, launching into the storm with a determined bark. Frost's silhouette remained barely visible ahead, guiding, demanding. They plunged into white chaos. Snow blew sideways, blinding and merciless. Emily gripped Ranger's harness for balance, boots slipping as the path vanished beneath her feet. Frank kept leading, though every step fought the weight of the wind. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Suddenly the trees thinned, unveiling the ravine, a jagged scar in the earth. From below came a chorus of desperate yelps. Frank dropped to his knees, peering over the edge. 3 small wolves, gray fur matted with ice, were trapped on a narrow ledge. And across from them, looming like a nightmare carved of stark white and hunger, stood a polar bear. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall on all fours, with matted fur stained by dirt and starvation. Its black eyes gleamed like chips of obsidian set in snow. Scar tissue ran along its right shoulder, a sign of past battles survived only through brutality. Emily's breath hitched. How did a polar bear get this far inland? Frank growled. They go where the food goes when the ice melts. He's starving, desperate. That's when they become killers. The bear turned its skull-wide head toward them, rumbling a warning that vibrated the earth. The pups whimpered, pressed against the rock wall. Frank's hand tightened on the rifle. His heart hammered like artillery fire against bone. He had faced death many times in desert heat, jungle rot, urban ruins, but this death had claws and the scent of his worst failures. He stepped forward, planting his boots firmly. Emily, stay behind me. Ranger, guard her. Ranger resisted, wanting to leap to the pups, but Frank's command rooted him where he stood, muscles vibrating with tension. The bear advanced. Frank raised the rifle. His aging eyes squinted as wind screamed past. One shot might scare it off or provoke it. But if he didn't try something, those pups would be mauled alive, and Emily could be next. He inhaled slowly. For a heartbeat, the world sharpened, every snowflake suspended, every fear silenced. He saw Mary's gentle smile, Laura's tearful eyes, Emily's trembling courage. He fired. The bullet struck the ice inches from the bear's paws, exploding shards upward. The beast roared, backing away uncertainly. Frost lunged from the tree line, teeth bared, howling like a storm, given voice her fury, drawing the bear's focus. Now Frank barked. Ranger leapt down the slope, claws digging into icy rock. Emily scrambled after him, reckless, but driven, reaching for the nearest pup. She grabbed its scruff and hauled it up. Ranger nudged the second pup toward Frank, who dragged it over the ledge. Frost snapped and snarled her body, a living shield between predator and pack. The bear reared, slashing a paw that could have broken Frost's spine. Frank fired again, louder, closer, forcing the beast back with violence and fury. When the last pup was safe, Frost darted away, tail lashing. With one last thundering roar, the bear retreated into the blizzard, swallowed by whirling white. Frank collapsed to one knee, chest heaving. Emily cradled a shivering pup, tears mixing with snow on her lashes. Ranger licked Frost's muzzle, checking for wounds. "You okay, Frank?" asked Emily, breath ragged. She nodded, though she wasn't convincing, shaking from both cold and terror. "You could have died." "So could they," he said. His voice was rough but steady. "Family, even when wild, deserves saving. They needed shelter before the storm devoured them next." Frost nudged Frank's leg, then bounded ahead, beckoning. They followed her into a hollowed ice cave tucked into a cliffside. Inside, the wind dulled to a distant moan. The wolves huddled together, Emily curling between Ranger and the pups for warmth. Frank sat nearby, staring into the dark beyond the cave entrance. At last, Emily spoke softly, voice trembling from more than cold. "You weren't afraid of the bear. You were afraid of failing again." Frank didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed outward, but his heart was trapped in the past. When he did speak, his voice was low, ragged. "In the war, you don't get to save everyone," he said. "But you still remember every face you lose." Laura was the face I couldn't forget. Emily leaned gently against Ranger, drawing strength from his steady heartbeat. "You saved me," she whispered. Frank shook his head, slightly stubborn, even in guilt. "Maybe. But I should have saved your mother first." The silence that followed felt heavy but not hopeless. Warmth, subtle and fragile, began to build, not just from wolf fur and shelter, but from truth finally spoken aloud. Emily looked at Frank with calm conviction. "You can't change the past, but you can choose what to do with what's left." Ranger planted his head on Frank's knee again, an anchor in a world that kept shifting beneath his feet. Frank finally met Emily's eyes. In them he saw Laura, and he saw a chance he wasn't sure he deserved, but one he would no longer run from. Far above, wind howled like spirits scouring the mountains. But inside the cave, the family, broken, redesigned, reborn, held together against the storm. Morning came slow and reluctant, like the sun itself feared disturbing the peace inside the ice cave. The storm had finally unclenched its fists, leaving a rugged world forged anew in white silence. Frank Miller stepped out first, his boots sinking into drifts soft as flour, the air so crisp it cut straight through his flannel and into bone. But he did not shiver, not after what they had survived. Ranger trotted beside him, tail swaying with renewed purpose. Frost and her wolves emerged, too shaking snow from their thick winter coats like ghosts stepping out of a dream. Emily Carter followed, leaning one hand on the cave wall as she steadied herself. Though pale, she moved with a determination that belied her lingering weakness. Her gray sweater hugged too loosely to her small frame, but she held her head high, dark hair whipping in the wind and eyes bright against the cold. She had come to this frozen wilderness seeking a story about wolves, but she had found a family she never knew she was missing. Frank scanned the pack, always counting. The pups huddled closely to their mother, alive and unharmed. Relief warmed him from the inside, melting layers of fear he'd carried too long. The walk back to the cabin took hours, every step a reminder of why they still breathed. The sun peeked through ragged clouds, kissing the world with gold. When they reached home, Frost nudged Emily's leg once before leading the pack back into the trees, slipping into shadows where wild hearts belong. Inside, the cabin felt smaller than Frank remembered, not claustrophobic, but intimate. Emily brewed hot cocoa over the flame, her hands still clumsy from cold. Frank sat at the table, studying the compass once more, its metal warmed by proximity to hope. "We need to register this land," Emily said, setting a steaming mug before him. "Anchor it legally as a protected wolf sanctuary, so no logging company or developer can ever take it from you. From them." Frank gave her a look, half skepticism, half admiration. "You know how to do that." Emily's lips curved into the faintest smile, one that carried her mother's courage. "Mom taught me everything worth knowing, including how to fight for what matters." Frank's eyes stung. He blinked away the burn. "This land, it's theirs as much as mine." "It was hers too," Emily added gently. Frank nodded and took a sip. The warmth seeped through the cracks inside him. They worked for days, paperwork online, calls, talking to officials in Anchorage who still remembered that Miller fella who vanished after his wife passed. A woman from the Wildlife Preservation Office came by snowmobile to inspect the land. Her name was Julie Parker, mid-40s, compact and sturdy, in a snow parka twice her size. She had curly chestnut hair tucked under a beanie and eyes that sparkled with curiosity. She spoke quickly, always 3 thoughts ahead, yet listened with care, nodding whenever Emily explained the wolves' importance to the region's fragile ecosystem. "That pack is something special," Julie said, scratching Ranger behind the ears, with confidence born from years of fieldwork. "I think we can make this sanctuary happen. Anchorage needs a win against all this climate chaos." Frank grunted. Compliments made him itch. Julie smiled knowingly. "You're not much for talking, huh? Used to be, he muttered before talking, cost me everything. Julie paused, studying him more softly. Maybe it's time talking gives something back. When she left, promising a fast-tracked approval, Frank stood with Ranger and Emily on the porch, watching her snowmobile disappear into a cloud of kicked-up frost. Emily nudged Frank's elbow. She liked you. Frank snorted. She liked the wolves. Same thing Emily teased. For the first time in decades, Frank laughed. It sounded rusty, surprised by its own escape. That weekend, Frank bundled himself in flannel and heavy coat and drove his old truck into Anchorage. Emily insisted on coming cheeks pink with excitement and nerves. Ranger rode shotgun tail, beating against the seat like a drum. They stopped first at a small shop, Flowers and Pines, where a friendly elderly florist named Beatrice Lund, short and round with hair white as icicles, arranged a simple bouquet of winter lilies. She didn't ask why Frank's hands trembled as he paid. She simply offered a warm pat to his wrist. The cemetery lay quiet under a blanket of snow. Granite stones jutted out like memories refusing to be forgotten. Frank's breath misted before him as he approached a modest headstone, polished smooth with care. Laura Miller Klein, 1981-2024, Forever Loved, Never Forgotten. Emily knelt first, brushing away a powdering of fresh snow. Ranger sat by her side, ears low, sensing the gravity of the moment. Frank hovered behind her, unable to move forward, as his heart waged war with his regret. Emily placed her hand on the stone. "Hi, Mom," she whispered. "I brought him." Frank shut his eyes. Emily looked back and extended her hand, gentle invitation, no pressure. He took it. Together, they stepped forward. Frank knelt, every joint protesting his breath, catching on a sob he refused to release. He laid the lilies softly atop the stone. "Laura!" His voice cracked like ice splitting under weight. "I'm too late. I always was. But I'm here now. And I swear, I won't lose Emily the way I lost you." The admission broke something open in him. Tears fell hot onto snow. Emily squeezed his hand, not as comfort, but as family. Frank pulled the silver compass from his pocket. Thumb brushing the engraving, he set it beside the flowers. "Guide me better this time," he whispered. A soft howl echoed from the trees lining the cemetery. Frost and the pack watched from a distance, silent witnesses to reunion. Frank rose slowly. Emily wiped her cheeks. Ranger nudged against Frank's hip, anchoring him once more. Frank turned to his granddaughter, snowlight glinting on his tears. "I lost one," he said hoarsely. "I won't lose another." Emily stepped forward and hugged him. Not tentative, not fragile. A real grounding embrace. Above them, the wolves howled again, not mourning, but celebration. Like the sky itself was welcoming home a soul long lost. Frank breathed deep. For the first time in 40 years, the air didn't feel like punishment. It felt like forgiveness. Sometimes in life, miracles don't arrive with thunder or bright flashes from the sky. They come quietly, like a lost grandchild at your door. Like a loyal dog who refuses to give up, like a second chance you thought was gone forever. Frank learned that even the coldest winters can break open into grace, and that no matter how far we wander, God always leaves a trail of light to lead us home. If you're carrying regret, loneliness, or wounds from the past, remember this: the same God who watched over Frank in the wilderness is watching over you. He works through unexpected people, unexpected moments, and unexpected blessings. Nothing is too broken for him to heal, and no distance is too great for him to cross. So as you finish this story, may God bless you with strength for today, hope for tomorrow, and a miracle in the place you need it most. And if this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs encouragement. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and subscribe so these stories can continue to reach those searching for a little light in their lives. May God's protection and peace be upon you and your family. Amen.